Hi, welcome to the 9th and final MOOC office hour. This is the office hour for the MOOC on environmental security and sustaining peace. I'm Carl Brook, Director of International Programs at the Environmental Law Institute. I'm here with Rebecca Arias Flores and Siri Astrustad. Rebecca is the UN Resident Coordinator and UNDP Resident Representative for Guatemala. She has more than 25 years of professional experience in development, international cooperation with the UN and UNDP, serving in different countries, including in El Salvador, Iraq, UN headquarters, Barbados, Honduras, Peru, and Panama. Her areas of expertise include energy, environment, gender equality, governance and peace building, poverty reduction and inequality, and sustainable development. Rebecca is a guest lecturer for the course. Siri is a senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute Oslo. She is also a course champion. Her research interests focus on, first, natural resources and civil war, and also on wealth sharing in post-conflict situations. Welcome both, and maybe Rebecca, if you could just say a few more words of introduction, and then to Siri, and then we'll start with the questions.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be participating in this course, Natural Resources and Environment, and I will be very pleased to participate in this lecture and answer your questions. Thank you.
And Siri?
Hello.
Sorry, Siri, you are muted. Still muted.
Is better?
That's good. Thank you.
Okay, good. So, okay, good morning. Really nice to be here, and now you can actually hear me, I hope. I'm very much looking forward to answering questions about natural resources and conflict, which is something I have worked on for the past 10 years.
Excellent. So today we'll be answering a mix of questions, some that were submitted by students ahead of today's session, and some that we are receiving from you live. We'll do our best to cover all of them. If we don't, we encourage you to post your questions in the office hours and other discussion groups. Rebecca, one of the MOOC's key takeaways is that context is critical. You've worked in a lot of different countries. As the UN Resident Coordinator for Guatemala, what do you think is unique about working in Guatemala on environment and natural resource management issues?
Guatemala is a country rich in natural resources. There are lots of projects related to mining, hydroelectric dams, etc., among others. Also, Guatemala is a country which has seen in the past few years, an increase in social conflicts. And most of these social conflicts have been related to the management of natural resources. In the past 20 years in Guatemala, the government authorized licenses to explore and exploit natural resources, whether for mining, for water, and others. However, as a result of this, all these extractive industries projects, there has been an increase in conflicts, and mainly because the government did not ensure consultation or prior consultation with the communities. Most of these projects, extractive industries projects, are located in areas where indigenous communities live, and that has been a major driver of conflicts. The the fact that these projects are in areas where indigenous communities live, but mainly the fact that the state did not ensure prior consultation to indigenous populations prior to granting such licenses. So we have seen an increase in this in the conflict. And this, I have to say, in spite of the fact that Guatemala has ratified the ILO Convention 169, which, as we all know, seeks to ensure prior and informed consultations with indigenous populations before any license is granted. But this has not been the case in Guatemala. And also, it is important to say that in Guatemala, indigenous communities have been historically excluded from development, and they have not been able to fully exercise their rights to their ancestral land, their rights to be recognized, to recognize their organizations. And of course, the indigenous communities have the highest levels of poverty in the country, highest levels of malnutrition, lower access to education, to health. So all of these problems add to the issue of the non-consultation with indigenous communities. And so the communities see that they do not benefit from these extractive industries projects, and this is why conflict have become a very important issue for the country. So the main obstacles to prevent and resolve socioeconomic conflicts affecting indigenous populations are limitations to the exercise of their rights, their human rights, I would say.
I'm curious. It sounds a number of these challenges and dynamics. Other countries have some of the similar dynamics, and some are facing them, some are addressing them more effectively than others. And how do we manage this tension between the fact that each context is unique and there are some echoes that we see in other places? That, you know, how do we learn from situations, but not just rubber stamp or kind of apply in a cookie cutter fashion the same solution? Do you know what I'm saying?
Oh, can you please repeat the last part?
So there is a tension between recognizing that each context is unique and saying, and if it's unique, then to what extent do lessons from other countries apply? Because this is a different context.
Yeah.
And so how do we balance that tension between the uniqueness of that context and the fact that there are other countries that are struggling with free prior informed consent? There are other countries dealing with social conflicts over minerals. It's not entirely alien to other countries. There are a lot of similarities, even if there are differences.
I think that probably the unique situation of Guatemala is because that Guatemala went through a civil war, a long conflict, where thousands of people died during that conflict, and that indigenous communities were mainly affected by the conflict. So the communities, of course, during the conflict were the ones that suffered the most in terms of people killed or massacres, etc. So now that the situation with the extractive industries projects, now that the communities are demanding that that they be heard, that their rights be respected. There is a tendency to criminalize such protests and such demands by indigenous communities. So in a way, there is a feeling that if these issues, if the issue of prior consultation to indigenous populations and the rights are respected, there is a feeling that the potential for escalation of conflict is very high, and that if this situation is not resolved, the conditions for conflict to escalate are very high. So I think that the post-conflict situation makes, I would say, the situation even worse, because then people think that if the causes of conflict are not resolved, then the conflict probably may not be another civil war, but the conflict will become difficult to resolve, because it will not be just in one community, the conflict, or in a few, but in many communities. So I think that this is probably, in my view, the uniqueness of the situation in Guatemala, that we are living in a post-conflict situation where most of the peace agreements have not been implemented. For instance, the agreements related to the rights and identity of indigenous populations have been implemented probably 35% of those agreements. So there are still unresolved issues in Guatemala related to the implementation of the peace agreements, and this adds up to the situation now of the conflicts related to the use of natural resources.
Siri, I'm wondering, in the places you've worked, have you seen some similar dynamics?
When it comes to context-related issues, you mean?
Well, I'm curious about the issues of failure to implement the peace agreements, the lingering lack of trust, the
yes.
social conflicts around mines and so forth.
Certainly, when it comes to the lack of trust, when I worked in, for example, Brazil, it's been obvious that the lack of trust between the communities and local governments, and also the extractive industries working in the region, is a big part of the social conflicts, and the fact that a lot of the companies have not been able to build up trust, which also goes years back. Even if there are new companies coming in, you have a population which have suffered from extractive industries or extraction of resources for decades, and the trust is not getting better, even if new companies come in. So I think it's important for companies to work on those issues.
I'm curious, when one goes in, whether as a researcher or as a practitioner, into a new country, there are some things that you might see that look familiar. I've seen this before in Peru, in Brazil, but the context is different. How do you try to understand that, or kind of that tension between this looks familiar, but this is a different context? How do you think about that? How do you work in that situation?
So when in different contexts, I often seen that there is same root causes, that there are frustrations over how the revenues have been distributed, about environmental issues, but that the way people are reacting is different. So, for example, in the Niger Delta, and also in the region in Brazil, in this northeast, which I have worked, you see the same root causes. But on the other hand, you cannot compare what has happened in the Niger Delta with what has happened in Brazil. Brazil it's not a civil war in the same way it has been in Nigeria, but we can certainly see the same root causes. And I think part of the reason why you see a different outcome has to do with institutions and has to do with maybe experience in areas with different how to handle issues like that.
If I may add something, yeah, now that Siri has mentioned the issue of institutions, a big problem I see in Guatemala is that the institutions are weak, and unfortunately, that does not help, because there is a need to strengthen capacities in national institutions to promote policies to address these issues. For instance, to prevent crises, to prevent conflicts and address conflicts and transform conflicts. So in Guatemala, there has been very little capacity to do this. And so even if the government signed agreements and conventions, etc., but if there is no capacity, not only is the political will, it's important at the decision makers level, but also the capacity. So I think that this lack of capacity has been an obstacle for the implementation of the prior consultation with the indigenous populations. And of course, as you can also say, the lack of resources to meet the needs of the indigenous populations, to meet the needs of the poor populations. Of course, I have to say that in Guatemala, unfortunately, there is high levels of corruption have also affected the country, and this also does not contribute to a good performance of the national institutions. So corruption has been a major problem. And this is why in Guatemala we have an international commission against impunity, which is the only country in the world that has such, well, no, now Honduras has a similar one, but only Guatemala and Honduras have such international commissions to address issues of corruption and impunity. Because in Guatemala, like I said, this is a structural problem, and it has not allowed the government and the institutions to function well. And of course, a lot of resources have been lost due to corruption. And this is why the government has not been able to invest in the development of the citizens, in particular in reducing poverty and reducing malnutrition, ensuring access to health and education, etc. So this is also another problem, a big problem in Guatemala.
Student just asked a related question. The large-scale exploitation of natural resources in all countries has agreements on licenses, contracts, and so on. But the deepest issues are the lack of prior consultation with the community. Why? I think that flows nicely from what you just said, Rebecca. I'm wondering if you might expand on that. Maybe Siri could jump in.
I can say something about it related to what we have looked at, and it's what it seems like is that when you have contracts and deals on national level or maybe on state level, when you transfer that to a local level, to a host community level, it's much more difficult to force through. And partly our experience is that it's because there's community, the civil society is not a homogeneous group, and it's often lack of trust between the civil society and the citizens, between civil society members. So it's difficult to sort of look at them as one group and know who to sort of act with or interact with or seek consultation with. And the second is that when the companies who are actually in a community often are have to sort of are responsible towards their host, their home country, and certain things they have to abide to. And thirdly, it's a lot of the agreements on when it comes to royalties, where company or factories can be placed, are not done on the local level with the local government. It's done on state government or national government. So the local government doesn't necessarily have a say in how these things are dealt with, and they don't know that a company is coming in until they're actually there, which also means that they don't get a lot of the royalties. So the stakeholders who are actually in the host communities are often restricted by other things. So it's a more difficult, maybe, or at least a very different dialogue and communication than it is on a national level.
It seems that part of this, in addition to the political economy, is also, frankly, the law. That if you're dealing with extractives, oil, gas, minerals, most countries provide that is owned by the national, whether it's by the country, by the people, by the national government, but it's part of the nation's natural patrimony. And so the ILO 169, which provides for free prior informed consent, that usually applies more to things on the surface, forests, wildlife, terrestrial resources, and the subsurface rights tend to be more the domain of the national government. Some countries do provide for consultation with respect to extractives, but that's less common. So I feel like the law, kind of the legal side of it, probably is part of the situation. In addition to some of the questions that Rebecca had raised earlier about impunity and corruption.
Yeah, I would like to say that, or emphasize that it's important, the lack of trust between the state institutions and the communities, and in Guatemala in particular, the indigenous communities. And this is, and also it was the same case in Peru, a lack of distrust among the communities and the government institutions and the extractive industries companies. But particularly the distrust with the government is related to the lack of response of the government to the community's demands. And the communities, I remember in Peru, when they were in some discussions or consultations to address some conflicts, and they would sign agreements, the communities or the representatives would say, why do we have to believe that this time you will implement these agreements if historically you have never complied with your commitments? So the distrust is related to the fact that there has not been compliance with the agreements or with the commitments. So they say, well, the governments or the institutions sign anything, but then the issue is implementation. So that's the big part of all the, when we have to address conflicts and manage and transform and resolve the conflicts. If there is no commitment and if there are no resources to implement the agreements, that's I think that's a big problem. And that's why the indigenous populations don't feel that even if they are consulted, the issues will be resolved. And that's why sometimes they are reluctant and they don't believe even if they are consulted. Right now, for instance, in Guatemala, the Constitutional Court issued a resolution requesting the National Congress to issue and approve a law to implement the prior consultation according to the 169 ILO Convention. However, a lot of the indigenous communities do not want to have a law, and they are not in agreement. I mean, there is a big distrust, and they don't think that with the law the issue will be resolved. So it's not only, it's not necessary, it's not sufficient to have only the legislative framework. There is a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of building trust, building consensus around these issues, and incorporating and integrating the communities in developing a shared vision for the management and the use of natural resources. I think there is a need for a broader dialogue beyond just the consultations.
Maybe pivoting on this, we see that communication is a central theme of this course. Might you be able to describe a particular instance in which you adjusted your own communication style to reflect the context, and what problems were you trying to address, and how did your communication adjustment change the situation and change the engagement with the situation?
Are you referring to communications related to addressing conflicts?
Well, or it could be addressing decisions in a conflict sensitive situation where you're trying to prevent conflicts, and you realize, or you know what the you know that there are sensitivities, or there's a lot that we can say about how others might communicate better. What I'm curious about is, have there been instances where you've been talking to stakeholders or to the government, and you've tried to, given the sensitivities, you've had to adjust what you're saying or how you're saying it?
Yes. Well, I think that we have to be aware that not all conflicts can be resolved through dialogue and through multi-stakeholder dialogue. So sometimes you have to adjust your strategy and communications, particularly communication strategy, on what is it that you want or you aim to achieve, and be modest. If there is, for instance, we had in Peru at some point when I was the RC in Peru, we had a huge conflict in an area related to a big mining and copper project. And there was a lot of violence, and some people were killed. So we helped the government to set up a dialogue, a commission to manage that dialogue. But we had to communicate and to set objectives, not necessarily linked to the managing and solving the conflict, but mainly to reduce tensions, to reduce violence, because at that point it was more important to take actions to reduce violence, and not necessarily to solve the conflict, because the conflict was much more bigger. But it was important to communicate to the different stakeholders that the main issue at that moment was just to reduce tensions, to try to give space to each one, so that each sector would have their opportunity to explain their concerns, their demands, etc., but not necessarily with the aim to solve the conflict and to bring them to reach agreements, but mainly to, like I said, to reduce tensions and to avoid violence, because we had already had several people dead. So, I mean, sometimes, like I said, you have to change the strategy for dialogue, but also communicating to the people that, listen, we are not doing this so that you can agree on this project, or so that we will get your agreement or the community's agreement so that the project can go on. Because if the communities are protesting against the project, it's very difficult. You mainly have to do or take actions related to ease the situation and to build some trust. So I think in those contexts, it's important to have a very good communication strategy, and to also be able to change the strategy or the communications part, to be able to build that trust and at least to reduce tensions.
Siri, do you have anything to add here?
So I haven't worked much in conflict settings in sort of trying to prevent violence in conflicts. I researched them, but I do see that how things are communicated, particularly by, for example, the state and government, is important for how people react. For example, in how revenue from resources should be used, the level of resources, how much can you expect? So it's all about giving people sort of the correct information and not raising expectations, not creating unrealistic expectations. Be very clear on and honest on the things you say. So we see that some of the research we've done, we've seen that when people have too high expectations, that often creates tension and potentially violence. So I think that is an important part of the communication aspect as well.
Expectations regarding what?
Expectations about how much resources are in a region, for example. So the in Indonesia, the rebel group argued that the amount of oil that was still in Aceh was extreme, and that as long as they would win the civil war and people would support them, they would be extremely rich. But the truth was that there wasn't a lot of oil left in the region. Another example would be Tanzania, where in the south, where they have discovered gas outside the coast of Mtwara, all the way south. And the president has promised that this will help develop the region, the industry in the region. But what they are planning is to transfer all of the gas in a pipeline along the coast to Dar es Salaam. So nothing will actually go into the region. So these are things that people get frustrated about because the expectations are raised based on things that are not true.
We have a follow-on question regarding prior consultation. Student asks, they're worrying about oil exploration using fracking, hydraulic fracturing, without serious or even partial studies. They see this happening in the US, Colombia, and elsewhere. And they ask, do you think that we really have hope for real prior consultations in the context of fracking?
I don't have a lot of experience with fracking. That's not something I have worked on. I think part of the problem with speaking in general, and not only about fracking, is that when there are large sums of money involved, such as in oil exploitation, people would like to get the production going, and then I think prior consultations become less important, unfortunately. And also for the US, of course, being able to produce its own oil and not being reliant on areas like the Middle East, Nigeria, etc., of course, is very compelling. But I don't think I can answer the question properly whether we have hope for real prior consultations.
I would only say that the real consultations or prior consultations taking into account the rights of the communities or the indigenous communities can take place only when governments are really committed to respect the rights of the communities. Unless that is the case, I don't think that prior consultations will happen. But there has to be a real commitment and political will to do it and to respect their rights. Otherwise, this will not happen.
Your comment raises another question that has been asked. One of the themes of this course is the connection between human rights and environmental security. And wondering if you might be able to share how or where in your work that you've observed this connection between human rights and environmental security. And was it helpful to frame the discussion as one of human rights rather than natural resource management? So this might be the rights of indigenous communities. And also, what are the risks of framing issues around human rights?
Yeah, well, I think that this discussion of prior consultation to indigenous communities, or communities even if they are not indigenous, are very much linked to human rights. And I think that with this, we have to frame these discussions also around the respect of human rights of the populations. We know that in spite of the fact that the UN Declaration on the Human Rights of Indigenous Populations recognizes that all the rights according to their own institutions, I mean the indigenous communities or populations institutions, and also the rights according as stated by the state institutions, we know that they still do not exercise fully their rights. And I'm referring mainly to the indigenous communities. And why I refer more to the indigenous communities? Because we know that at least in Latin America, at least there has been some studies that show that 1/3 of the extractive industries projects are located in areas or territories where indigenous communities live. So this discussion is very relevant for the human rights of indigenous populations, and in fact, you know that we have the UN rapporteur on the human rights of indigenous populations, and this is a big issue for them. And this is an important issue, and they usually address the issue of prior consultation as a central issue when they go to countries. And by the way, this week we have the UN rapporteur on the human rights of indigenous populations in Guatemala. And this is one of the central issues that she will be addressing, the lack of prior consultation to indigenous populations in Guatemala. So I think that it's very relevant, and I would like to say that the different UN rapporteurs that we have had, in particular the previous rapporteur, Mr. James Anaya, made a lot of visits to countries, in particular in Latin America, and he made a lot of recommendations to the countries related to the prior consultation, and mainly to ensure that the rights of the indigenous populations are respected. And not only that they are consulted on the projects that will affect their communities, their lives, and also that there is compensation if there is damage to the environment or any other type of damage, but also that they fully participate as actors in the development process, as citizens that exercise fully their social, economic, cultural, and political rights. And so I think that the prior consultation seeks to ensure that their rights are fully respected, and that the communities exercise their rights. But like I said, not only to be consulted, but also to ensure that they fully enjoy the benefits of development, because I have said before that they have been excluded from the benefits of the social and economic development.
Siri?
Yeah, no, I also think that another area where this is linked is when you already started extracting the resources, and maybe there's been a lack of prior consultation, that renegotiation of contracts might also be extremely important for human rights, so that you get a proper workers' rights through renegotiations, better revenue sharing, so that you actually get paid properly, and that the host communities get better rewarded for the resources, and also to include more environmental issues and demanding that companies working in the areas actually have to abide by them. I think there's sort of something you can do even if this has not been taken into account or there's been a lack of prior consultation.
I wonder if there are any downsides to framing arguments in human rights terms.
Can you repeat, please? I couldn't hear you very well.
Sorry. I was wondering if there are any risks or downsides to framing arguments in human rights terms. If you're trying to convince the government to do something, is there a risk that it will be perceived differently or not as well if you frame it in human rights terms or in economic terms, that this is good for economic development? I ask because there's a very interesting case study of Rwanda, post-conflict Rwanda, where UNEP and UNDP looked at how important natural resources were to the economy and to livelihoods. And it was that economic analysis that convinced the government, with all the things that they were trying to deal with after the genocide, that they had to that they should prioritize natural resources. And I'm wondering if it had been framed as a human right, if the government would have prioritized that, or if they would have maybe said, well, we're dealing with a lot of human rights violations here. This is not, we'll worry about this one later.
Yeah, I think that the risk is probably more related to the fear or to the concern that governments may have, that if they have to ensure that the human rights of the indigenous populations are fully exercised, they will probably think that there will be no possibility to implement this type of projects, because they may think that, well, if we really comply with all and ensure that they fully exercise their rights, we will not be able to carry out this type of projects, because for instance, if we have to respect their ancestral lands or territories or their customs, their traditional institutions or organizations, their traditional vision, etc. So the risk is that the government may be reluctant because of that, because they will think that there will be more obstacles or difficulties to carry out these type of projects. And this is also happening, I should say, in Guatemala, because some communities are saying basically, we don't want this type of projects, because these projects are poisoning, are contaminating our water, our soils, etc. So, and there have been some big discussions and issues, because the private sectors has the position that, well, if we fully follow what the indigenous communities are saying, economic development will be will decrease. Our economy will get stuck. We will not be able to move forward because of all the these claims from the indigenous communities. So I think that is a big risk. I think it's important to mention it, because the governments and the private sector will see this as an impediment, as an obstacle for the development of the country. I remember very clearly when I was in Peru, and we had a meeting with the Secretary General and the President, and the Secretary General was asking the President, I will not say which president, to approve the prior consultation law, because at that point was not approved. And the President said, well, my main concern is to promote economic development for this country, for the entire population. And if there are some communities that are opposing to a project because the project goes through their lands, etc., I have to take into account the well-being of the whole country, not only of one community or a few communities. So this is the view that some governments may take, that if they take into account the interest or the demands of some groups or communities, this may impede the development of the whole country, and so the entire country will be negatively affected. So, but I mean, in the case of Guatemala, this is different, I should say, because in Guatemala, 40% or more is indigenous population. So,
Siri, do you have additional thoughts on this?
I think Rebecca is making a very good point that it makes it difficult to sort of choose between a potential economic source, particularly in a post-conflict situation where you're really dependent on some extra resources to rebuild the country, and then it's sort of you have to choose between something that will gain the entire country compared to something that is related to one group. That's obviously a difficult question, and it's also, if you look at Nigeria, where the oil is situated in the Niger Delta, and it's clear that it's the population of the Niger Delta bearing the issues or the problems, environmental problems with extraction. But there are areas in the country, like in the northeast, which is poorer than the Niger Delta, and which are not blessed with oil, basically, and do not have that to gain economic wealth. So what is fair in a way? And then that's a very difficult question, which I don't have an answer to.
But isn't that part of the importance of having that dialogue? Because it seems like there's this tension that is often set up, and I feel like it's often a false choice. You either have to respect human rights or you have to have economic development. And the work that both of you have done, research and on the ground, shows that you can have both. That one of the big issues is the community wants to make sure that it receives some benefits. This isn't an all or nothing. It's, there are wealth sharing arrangements. And so...
yeah. I'm not sure if my work shows that you can have both. Well, I guess what my work, or at least what I try to argue, is that it's difficult to find a solution which everyone thinks is fair. I mean, you can of course find one, but so again, an example of Nigeria, the population of Nigeria would like to get a much bigger share of the revenues than they get now. On the other hand, other areas need the development as well. So what is it that should weigh the heavier? Is it that everyone should get some development, or is it the region that hosts the resources that should get more? And how much is sort of compensating for environmental issues?
I think that, if I may make a comment, I think that it is possible to reconcile economic development objectives with respect of human rights. And it depends on the willingness of the actors to seek solutions that are, like we say, win-win solutions, right? So in Peru, I remember there were some examples, and there was one in particular that we in UNDP even documented or systematized. There was in a region in Peru, the governor of that region sat down with all the actors. That was a multi-stakeholder dialogue also, and with the companies, the mining companies, and with the communities, and they reached agreements, and there were commitments to invest in education, in health, etc. So that was a very good example of a situation where you can reach agreements that seek benefits for all actors, and where communities can be satisfied with the results of the dialogue and with the agreements, then the issue comes with the implementation. But but it's possible. I don't think that it's impossible.
I guess what I was trying to suggest was that it's often framed as a choice. You have to do this or this. Mm-hmm. And it seems that one can strengthen the human rights argument with economic arguments and economic approaches like benefit sharing. Mm-hmm. And one can strengthen the economic case by recognizing that if human rights are not respected, that there will be protests, and this will be, it's bad for business. It's well documented that these sorts of social protests can cost millions or hundreds of millions of dollars and can doom or gravely threaten the viability of the project. So that there's a middle ground, where in that middle ground makes people happy as opposed to not horribly unhappy. It's another question, but we can be.
Yeah, I just wanted to share an example right now in Guatemala of that situation. There is a mining company that their activities were suspended because of the Constitutional Court issued a statement stopping that company's activities because they didn't carry out the prior consultation, and they have been losing a lot of money, and they are complaining that when are we going to be allowed to continue our operations? But basically the court told them, do you have to do the prior consultation? So the companies can lose a lot of money. And why did the court reach that conclusion? Because there were a lot of protests, and the indigenous communities presented a demand before the Constitutional Court. So there is a high price that the companies can pay if they don't do the prior consultations in the right manner and don't take into consideration the human rights of indigenous populations. But of course, you need also to have state institutions responsible and committed to ensure the respect of human rights of the indigenous populations or the communities in general.
No, I certainly agree that it's possible to find a middle road or to come to an agreement, particularly if it's sort of if we're only talking about one region. So we're talking about one community where we need to deal with human rights, and where you also have questions about economic spending. But when it comes to sort of, again, Nigeria, how do you deal with the fact that the Northeast also need development much more than maybe in the Niger Delta? They don't have oil. They don't have any resources they can rely on. How do you put that into the equation? And I think that is becoming a much more problematic issue than only dealing with a local situation, which is complex and difficult enough.
And so this is the space where Boko Haram has risen.
Yes, exactly. So it's, but it's been an extremely poor, underdeveloped region for many years before the Boko Haram. I guess it's also partly the reason why they have been able to get sort of the presence that they have. This is an underdeveloped region.
I'm wondering if we might shift gears a little, unless Rebecca, you have any suggestions on this topic.
On what particular topic?
So it's a very interesting question that in Nigeria, you have in the southeast, you have the Niger Delta, which has a lot of oil, and there's a tension between the communities in the Niger Delta and the central government over sharing of those oil revenues. There's another part of the country in the northeast That's very poor. It's semi-arid, arid, and they don't have oil, and they need economic development. They need the revenues from the oil development, but they don't have oil. And it's in this space that Boko Haram has grown. And so Siri was highlighting the fact that often the focus is on the dynamic between the producing community that's affected by the oil or mineral development or whatever extractive resource project you have, and the central government. How about this other space that also needs economic development and might be vulnerable to radicalization? How do you calculate that? How do you account for them where they don't have a direct interest in the oil, but they have grievances against the government, which they perceive as getting rich from the oil and not sharing it with them?
Yeah, well, I think that the government have the role of ensuring that the income and the wealth of the country is fairly distributed, and for that reason, I mean, for that they have the tax policies that should ensure that the government must invest in the poorest areas. Of course, we know that in some countries we have a situation like that. You know, in some areas they're rich in resources, natural resources, and other areas are not. So the governments have to ensure that all poor areas are attended, and that they invest those resources not only in the rich areas but also in the poor areas as well, because in the end the governments are responsible for the well-being of the entire country. So this issue is important also because in some countries they have, like in Peru, they have specific tax on revenues coming from extractive industries that benefit those particular areas or regions in the country. But at the same time, not everything goes to those regions. It's just part of that. And then the rest, the government uses to invest in other areas that are not rich in natural resources. So I think that there has to be an equitable distribution of benefits, not only for the rich natural resource areas, but also for the poor areas.
I think we have time for one last question. This actually has two parts. Rebecca, in your lecture, you mentioned that many conflicts, especially in Latin America, arose during the commodity boom in the 2000s, and with the incoming mines and resource extraction. Two questions associated with this. First of all, how vulnerable are conflict-sensitive locations to this type of economic shock today? And secondly, what could be done to mitigate these economic and social risks?
How vulnerable? I think that, well, there's highly vulnerable, still vulnerable. I don't think the situation has changed. I mean, since this international boom of commodities started, I think the situation continues. Of course, when the prices of commodities go down, of course, mining or other activities slow down. But because natural resources, some countries are reaching natural resources of different types. It's not only mining, but can be water, biodiversity, etc. So I think that the communities are still vulnerable to this situation, and I think that what the governments have to do and the companies is ensure that there is a policy to promote dialogue and and to prevent conflicts on a permanent basis as a state policy, not only when there are conflicts. I think there has to be a policy as a state policy to ensure that conflicts are addressed, to prevent conflicts first, and then ensure that conflicts, when they arise, they are managed and they are transformed, and through dialogue and other mechanisms, and ensured also that there is a capacity, not only at the central government, but also at the local government's level. And this is also very important because when conflicts arise, the local governments are the first ones that have to be able to respond to these situations.
Siri, I'm wondering if you have thoughts on how to mitigate against some of the economic and social risks associated with the commodity boom.
No, I think Rebecca is right that dialogue is important, and that started before you actually have the conflict. But I think it's also important that even if you have this as a national policy, that it's not only on the national level, that it has to also be done in the actual communities. If you, for example, like the ITI have the civil society is represented by a few representatives as opposed to represent civil society in the entire country, they are bound to have internal conflicts because certain civil society groups are in conflict with each other. They're not going to be able to represent everyone. So I think it's important that a dialogue is also taken down at a local level.
Also, I would like to add that it is important to have and carry out strong evaluations, capacity to carry out strong, independent evaluations on the environmental, social, and economic impacts of the extractive industries projects on the populations or on the communities. Because many times, and I have seen this at least in Peru, in Guatemala, that the companies or the enterprises are the ones that carry out the environmental impact assessments, and that shouldn't be the case. I think these have to be independent because they have interests, right? So, and this is also has been as a big source of conflicts also when they present their environmental impact assessments. Of course, communities don't trust those assessments. So it's important to have that capacity at the government level to carry out such evaluations, so that they are, the communities would be able or do not reject such assessment. And also it's important to build capacities in the communities, because here also we have to address the issue of asymmetries in terms of knowledge and capacity. And it's important to build capacity in the communities, providing them with knowledge, information, advice, etc., for them to be able to participate in a better way. Oops.
I'm afraid we lost Rebecca there. I'd like to also add that one of the things that we've seen, one way to help cope with the stresses that are associated with the commodity boom is to recognize that countries don't always have the best information or negotiating capacity. And sometimes we've seen countries get a lot more money by, first of all, not selling off all the concessions at first, but to do, some and then some and then some. And secondly, not to just enter into contract negotiations, but to start with an auction. And that we saw this with, for example, Equatorial Guinea, and they received a lot more money for their offshore oil and gas than had been offered initially. And so I think one of the challenges is that there's such a pressure on countries to generate revenues that they don't always get the best deal that they could, and they also rush into it and that rushing does not allow for the sort of consultation that often is necessary. Siri, I don't know if you have any final thoughts. We need to wind up the office hours soon.
No, I think I just want to echo Rebecca's last point about strengthening local communities. And I also think that companies should be bolder in the way they engage local communities, such as bringing them on board as board members and things like that, to be bolder in the way they approach the communities. I think that's my final thoughts on the issue.
Great. Well, thank you, Siri. Thank you, Rebecca. And thank you all for joining us for this 9th and final office hour. It has been a wonderful discussion, and I want to thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you.